Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan. The terrorist attack on an Indian Air Force base at Pathankot on January the 2nd has once again shone the spotlight on the Jaish-e-Mohammed and other groups in Pakistan whose pursuit of religious purity has in many ways undermined the stability of Pakistan as a country, the Pakistani state, and had all kinds of negative consequences for Pakistani civil society and, of course, the status and position of religious minorities in Pakistan. Joining me to discuss the nature of these groups and the kind of impact that their goal, this pursuit of religious purity, has had on Pakistan over the past few decades is Farahnaz Ispahani, member of the Pakistan People's Party, former member of the National Assembly. You were also media advisor to President Zardari, and of course, author of a new book, Purifying the Land of the Pure, published just now, and of course, dealing with the status of Pakistan's religious minorities. Farahnaz, thank you very much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's tempting to look at Pathankot and the nature of the groups involved, but I want to go back to where the story begins, which is the creation of Pakistan. There's this famous quote of the Quaid-e-Azam where he says in his speech that you will find that in the course of time, Hindus would cease to be Hindus and Muslims would cease to be Muslims, not in the religious sense, because that is the personal faith of each individual, but in the political sense as citizens of the state. From this sentence, it's very clear that Jinnah Sahab envisaged Pakistan as a state that would not be an Islamic state, that would in fact be a secular state which would equally respect all citizens. But that storyline got abandoned. How and why did that happen is, of course, in many ways an issue that you address in your book. But tell us where the first attacks took place on the idea of Pakistan as a secular state.
Well, you know, people often argue about what Mr. Jinnah really wanted. He absolutely did want a Muslim majority state, but that did not mean that he wanted a state where people who were not Muslim were not equal citizens of the state. And there's a big difference in that argument. And the reason why I know this to be true, and not just what first generation Pakistani would wish to be true, is within his lifetime after partition, Mr. Jinnah was dying within the first year. And he gave a very, very famous speech on minorities in Pakistan. And this was called the August 11th speech. That speech was suppressed while the Quaid-e-Azam was still alive. So the bureaucrats and the politicians in the wing were already trying to hijack Mr. Jinnah's idea of what Pakistan should be while the founder was still alive. So first you have the suppression of the speech, and then very soon...
So what form did the suppression take? I know that there isn't a recording today, for example. But the text was surely discussed, published at the time.
It was not published right away, and the radio recording, from what I understood, disappeared completely. And the print record of that speech only came later and with a great deal of push. And so it was really the first major inkling of how quickly it all was going wrong. Your second big sort of indicator is the objectives resolution, which again was very soon after 1949, after the first Constituent Assembly debates. Liaquat Ali Khan, our first Prime Minister, was already in Parliament putting forward and getting past the objectives resolution, which clearly said this was a state of Muslims and for Islam, and that the Quran and Sunnah and Sharia were the foremost bases for the laws and way forward for Pakistan. So, in a way, when you look at all of this, you think to yourself, but Liaquat was not this man. How did he come to be a mini Maulana Maududi, sounding like a clergyman? And then you realize, what I realized with a lot of research was, most of these leaders came from what had become India. They did not have political constituencies. They did not have local backing. All they had at that point, what they realized was Islam as the glue, to glue themselves in their position.
Right.
And that's
so not so much to bond the people of this new nation together, but to actually cement their own connection with the state.
Absolutely right. And so the Islam in danger line, which was used during the sort of the big political season pre-partition by the Muslim League, was brought back post-Pakistan to solidify the political and bureaucratic establishment.
Was this in some ways inevitable? There are plenty of examples of states or countries with a Muslim majority, Egypt, for example, that did not think of themselves consciously that we are a Muslim majority state. They just happen to be one. And the trajectory that constitutional government takes in a place like Egypt is rather different from the way it evolved in Pakistan. Was it because Pakistan consciously thought of itself as a state for Muslims? In other words, was this solidifying of the Islamic character of the state in some ways inevitable?
I don't think it was inevitable.
Okay.
And I think there were many, many markers in the history of Pakistan, starting with Mr. Jinnah's speech that was suppressed, then the Objectives Resolution, and the fact that only a Muslim could be president, and later it became only a Muslim could be president and prime minister. And then you go on through the history, the suppression of the Hindus of East Pakistan, the terrible brutality perpetrated against them. Ayub Khan's idea of the worst, his quotes, that the worst thing that could befall a nation like ours are the Hindus and the Bengalis who have Hindu culture, that our poor country being beset by that. And each military dictator and civilian sort of government in Pakistan, you notice the leader has one particular pet peeve against a community.
Right.
And so you see Islamization, which is when you first, after partition, lose the Hindu and Sikh populations. So demographically, the country becomes,
at least on the western
Islamic
side, but on the eastern side, there was a large Hindu population. And your book actually begins with this quote by J. Mandal, who was Pakistan's law minister, who warns of the imminent departure of Hindus from East Pakistan.
Absolutely. And you look at Mr. Jinnah's cabinet, where you had a Hindu law minister, you had an Ahmadi foreign minister, you had Mr. Jinnah as a Shia, and a very mixed cabinet. And you look today at the fact that in Pakistan, we are so proud that we have one Christian minister, Kamran Michael. And this is the same Kamran Michael who a couple of years ago was not allowed to present the budget of the government of Punjab because he was not Muslim. So, over and over again, and then you come to the blasphemy laws, and you come to the purification of then the non-Muslim start.
Right.
With the Ahmadis of
I
Pakistan.
want to come to the way that decision was taken a little bit later, but isn't it also true that early attempts to declare the Ahmadis non-Muslim right after partition and the early years of Pakistani independence were actually resisted by a wide section of Pakistani political opinion, by the military as well? So what changes? Why is it that the attempt to isolate Ahmadis in the early years of Pakistan are unsuccessful, despite what you say, leaders wanting to say Islam khatre mein hai?
Well, till 1953, when Pakistan has its first martial law in Lahore, when there are these massive riots against the Ahmadis and wide-scale killing, you have the Munir Commission report, Chief Justice Munir, in which he assembles hundreds of clerics, and no two clerics can decide who is a Muslim.
Right.
Some say that the Shias and the Ahmadis are kafirs, are non-Muslims, are apostates. Some say everyone except Deobandis are, and this goes on and on. And he says very clearly, he says, you know, you can't make a decision on any way forward on this, you know. So after that, basically, the interesting thing is in 53, when you see the Ahmadis being killed, you have this commission led by a very, very smart and thoughtful man. During Mr. Bhutto's time, when you have this huge assault on the Ahmadis, what happens now? You're slowly seeing the change in how the state, these are all state decisions. Right. It's the punishment of the minority, it's the punishment of the besieged. Instead of going after the perpetrators of the attacks on the Ahmadis, are declared non-Muslims.
So there's an attempt to conciliate with or to appease the attackers. Right.
But basically, people like Maulana Maududi, who opposed Pakistan, became the most influential voices in Pakistan post Mr. Jinnah's death.
So they played an influential role in defining how the state which they opposed, what contours it would take. And there's an enormous irony in that. I mean, Jinnah Sahib himself had the view that if somebody considered themselves to be Muslim, then they were Muslim.
Absolutely. In fact, the Ahmadis were among the biggest backers of Pakistan, financially and every other way.
On that note, Farahnaz, we'll have to take a break. Do keep watching. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back. You're watching IST. My guest for this show is Farahnaz Ispahani. Farahnaz, before we took the break, we were discussing the final action that was taken against the Ahmadis in the 70s. Now, explain this to me. Why would a secular politician like Zulfikar Ali Bhutto spearhead the move to get the Ahmadis declared non-Muslims? I can understand Liaquat in his time, I can understand military rulers, but why Bhutto?
Well, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, you know, this was a massive betrayal for the Ahmadis because they were very big supporters of Mr. Bhutto. But Mr. Bhutto had come into a great deal of pressure between the clergy, who thought he was not Islamic enough, and there was some Saudi pressure at that time, and, you know, there was military pressure. And Mr. Bhutto decided that this would, in one fell swoop, make everyone happy by declaring the Ahmadis non-Muslim.
Then he also banned alcohol, right?
Well, those came later. There were more and more desperate actions. You know,
once you go down that path.
Slippery slope. It's a slippery slope, and never ever do it. The moment you know, the combination of religion and politics, no matter how religious you are, which Mr. Bhutto wasn't, right? So, but the Ahmadis, so he declared them non-Muslim, and when the leadership came and spoke to him, he said, oh, don't worry about this will be reversed, because he did not understand the fundamental issue. Once you bring a religious law on the books, it is almost impossible to ever do away with it. So this entire community has to this day become non-Muslim. They cannot have the azan, the call to prayer. Their masjids cannot be called mosques, they have to be called houses of worship. If they, on their gravestones, have an Islamic prayer, the police have the right to go and scratch out all the prayers from the Quran Sharif. And to this day in Pakistan, every time any of us go to apply for a Pakistani passport, we have to sign that we consider the Qadianis, the Lahori group, non-Muslim.
Every citizen has to declare that he or she is committed to that.
You have to sign to that on the form for your application for a passport. And if you do not sign that form, so we are all implicit. Every Pakistani becomes complicit in the oppression of the Ahmadi Muslims. And it is a terrible burden to carry.
Right. And as you say, once you go down that slope, you encourage people who then, the Takfiri groups who say Shias are not Muslims, etc., etc.
And it's going that way, obviously. You see with all these jihadi groups, right? You have the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, for example, which is one of the groups which has a death threat against me. which is the anti-Shia group, which has killed Shias from Parachinar to Karachi to Quetta. And that is what, from the time General Zia set them up,
Right.
the first militia set up in
Right.
Pakistan and armed and trained was to kill Shias.
Right. And this is with the full patronage of the Pakistani state,
Pakistani state,
military,
Pakistani military.
under Zia-ul-Haq.
Pakistani military, the first jihadi group, which still, and after that, as we all know, many other groups have come in to perform other functions.
How central was the so-called Islamization as a means of legitimizing General Zia's dictatorship?
Well, Islamization, as I say, started with the culling of the Hindu and Sikh populations. First, you become demographically more Muslim. Then slowly, then your constitution
Right.
starts sort of saying that, you know, basically Muslims, Pakistan is a Muslim state. Then you start with Ayub and others who start on textbooks which all the culture is based on Islam and not South Asian culture. And little Hindu and Christian children and Ahmadi children have to read about themselves in these textbooks as belonging to dirty religions which, you know, practice in these dark, smoky places, unlike the clean, open masjids of the Muslims, you know. So the brainwashing of the entire population.
And that starts with Ayub.
So
Ayub,
that is from Ayub onwards. So that's phase 3. And then you come to, phase 2. Then phase 3, you come to Zia's Islamization, where he
or with Bhutto in between, in a way paving the way for...
Bhutto's was the first law.
Right.
Bhutto's was the first law with the anti-Ahmadi law. And after that, all the laws are General Zia-ul-Haq's. And it's what I call, he bureaucratized, right, the whole bureaucratization of Islam was what he did. Every segment of Pakistan's life, political and other, was made Islamic.
Right. Given the central role that the support for jihadi organizations played in the perpetuation of the Zia dictatorship and the instrumental use that he made of Islam to perpetuate his own rule, why was it not possible for democratic governments that followed Zia to quickly change or overturn some of these measures?
Well, the first government that came...
The Hudud ordinances, for example, or various other... Yeah.
The first government that came after Zia-ul-Haq was obviously was Benazir Bhutto. She was a very young woman who, after her father was murdered, went out to take on General Zia-ul-Haq. And she talked a great deal in her campaign about changing these Islamic laws, which she considered unfair. And the Hudud ordinances were a huge part of her mandate. And when she came in, as you know, that was a very short government. She tried very hard to bring the Hudud ordinances to the floor of Parliament, to change those, because specifically that law where a woman who's raped has to have 4 male witnesses, which still exists today, though there have been some legal changes to that. Within a very short amount of time, the army and the mullahs had made short shrift of her. She was out. Then you have Nawaz Sharif, then he's out. Then you have Benazir Bhutto again, and she's out. And then Nawaz again.
And
4 of them back to back.
Right.
So you don't have a proper government till 2008. Look at Pakistan's history. Till 2008, you do not have a democratically elected government that finishes its term in 2008.
Tell me about the Musharraf years, because in many ways he's a contradictory kind of character. It's under his watch that 9/11 happens, and Pakistan then makes a break with Taliban / Al-Qaeda, facilitates the American attack on these organizations. And he also begins to realize, as the tentacles of some of these groups spreads within Pakistan, that for its own survival, Pakistan has to make some kind of a rupture with its past support for these groups. But he doesn't take it far enough.
Well, it's interesting because right now, on one hand, I think Musharraf did feel he was a secular man and was generally on the issue of both religious minorities and a lot of liberal issues. He was considered to be, and he considered himself to be, quite open-minded. But when it came to jihad and jihadi groups now, you suddenly see a big difference. On the issue that he tried to make a difference, it was during his time that the Hudud ordinances there were
The modifications.
slight modifications to make, them a little bit fairer for women in a court of law. But on the other hand, it was a good jihadi, bad jihadi situation that really began in earnest during his time. If we refer to what's happening right now with Pathankot, it was during Musharraf's time, 13 years ago, that Jaish-e-Mohammed...
They tried to kill him, actually, right?
Well, they did,
I mean,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
But they grew, then they tried to kill him.
Yes.
Now they're back.
No, but apparently, so he closed them down 13 years ago. If he had closed them down 13 years ago, what are their offices doing still in existence in Pakistan? It is very hard to understand this. So clearly, both Mr. Masood Azhar was not done away with. Again, he was arrested in protective custody, and we see a rerun of the same event again. And this is where I say, as a Pakistani, and after the death of 60,000 Pakistanis in this war on terror internally, that these games these people play have got to come to an end.
We had hoped that the Army Public School massacre
Yes.
would lead to a sea change. Certainly, I think public opinion in Pakistan
Yes.
appeared pretty decisive in the need to fight against all of these groups, whether they target Pakistan or Afghanistan or India. But that broad understanding seems lacking when it comes to the Pakistani state as a whole. The anti-Indian groups continue to, in a way, flourish. They sometimes they lie low, but they're allowed to function. When will that change? And what's needed to change?
Most people thought that the Army Public School would be that unifying moment where both the army establishment and civil society and the political leadership would get together and work in tandem. I was not optimistic at that time, and I feel unfortunately I've been proven right. As I said before, good jihadi, bad jihadis, they may go after the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, but the TTP also works in tandem with a lot of these other groups.
Which are considered so-called good jihadis.
Good jihadis and bad jihadis. It's like many different mafia groups, and at certain points they're amorphous, and there's overlap, and that is something which is known. It is understood. So you cannot make this distinction anymore. There is no good jihadi. There are no good terrorists. And Pakistanis, the establishment, if they don't, how many more of us are going to die? How many more minorities and women and children can be sacrificed? For what?
Right.
Is it for the greater good of my country? I don't think so.
Right. On that eloquent note, Farahnaz Ispahani, Pakistani politician and author of this new book, Purifying the Land of the Pure, we will have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on Indian Standard Time.
Thank you so much.
Well, that wraps up this episode of IST. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you for watching.